Hi, I'm Bill Conger, Chief Curator at Peoria Riverfront Museum. We are opening an exhibition of railroader photography, Homefront photography from Jack Delano. And with me are two of the people who made this exhibition happen. Bon French and Scott Lothes, who worked with the Chicago History Museum and the Center for Railroad Photography and Art to create this exhibition. So we'd like to walk you through a little bit, but Bon, thank you for being here with us today.
Thank you, Bill. It's a thrill to be here. I grew up in Peoria, went to Woodruff High School. My parents lived here most of their lives and were involved in the Peoria Riverfront Museum and its predecessor, Lakeland Museum. So it's a pleasure to be back.
And Scott, you're with the Center for Railroad Photography and Art.
Yes, I'm the President and Executive Director up in Madison, Wisconsin, and this is an exhibition we put together 7 years ago with the Chicago History Museum, and it's a real thrill to have it here in Peoria.
We're thrilled. We are excited. So let's waste no more time and jump in. What would you like to look at? First of all, tell me about Jack Delano as we're moving toward
Scott, why don't you do that?
Sure. So Jack Delano was a photographer who worked for the Office of War Information during World War II, and he was assigned the task of documenting the nation's railroads, which were critical to the war effort, but particularly looking at the people of the railroads.
Yeah.
So not just the equipment, but the people behind the scenes, making the trains run, repairing them so they could go out on the road again. The railroads were incredibly busy during World War II, and the people had to work overtime to keep these trains running. And so this exhibition really uses his kind of humanistic approach to photography. And Delano was an immigrant. He came from Eastern Europe, and so he sort of had that sense of the immigrant's story, and so that was something he looked for in his photographs. The railroads were quick to hire immigrants to work in their repair shops in their yards all over Chicago and beyond. And so Delano really focused on kind of capturing that incredible swath of humanity that was working on the railroads and calling Chicago home. And so this is really the photographic story of Chicago's railroad community. And I think it's a phenomenal story and presented beautifully in Delano's black and white and notably color photography.
Right.
The color images in this show come from 1942 and 1943, and that was only 6 or 7 years after Kodachrome was introduced in 1936. So
Wow.
Some really early color photography done at an exceptionally high level, which was quite rare for the time.
With very low film speeds.
Yeah, no, I mean
ASA.
ASA 10, so I mean that's minuscule compared to what we have on our smartphones, and so you had to have a whole lot of light, or you had to have the camera locked down on a tripod for a very long exposure. So there were some great technical challenges to this work, but Delano really excelled at it.
And I would say, to add what Scott said, this is not about trains, it's about people, to say the least. And what's important here is it included women, it included people of color, and it included immigrants. And there's a great story and a great contribution that was made by all of these groups that was important, and Delano recognized that importance. And so actually what you won't see here is photography of railroad executives.
Right.
You'll see ordinary people captured in their everyday life in the shops and on the trains.
Excellent. Well, as we move to our first photograph, maybe we could talk about this image as we begin looking at the exhibition. What are we seeing here, Bon?
So this is a photograph of Illinois Central's South Water Street Yard in downtown Chicago. And what's amazing about this is the foreground is completely changed. This is where Millennium Park is today, the Aon building, the Fairmont Hotel, and lots of condominiums and office buildings. In the background, that still exists. That's the Wrigley building in the center and the Tribune Tower off to the right. And right out of the photo is Navy Pier, and behind the photographer is Lake Michigan. So it's
Wow.
The photo itself is an incredible story of the past and the transformation of downtown Chicago. So it's actually one of my favorite images,
Yeah, I mean,
taken in 1942, 43.
Just enough points of reference there that you can know where it is today, but so much of it's just utterly unrecognizable.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, it's a phenomenal image.
yeah.
So how many years was Jack photographing these rail yards in Chicago?
Well, the railroad project was only about 6 months. I think November of 1942 into
Okay.
April or even early May of 1943. So it was really a pretty short time and a very intensive period of photography. he had the full cooperation of the railroads to be able to make this happen. And he was really working pretty intently and diligently to cover as much of the Chicago railroad scene as he could during that time.
Wow.
Why don't we walk down to the Santa Fe roaders that came to Chillicothe?
Excellent.
But on the way, we might look at this yet another image of downtown Chicago with the Wrigley Building in the background there in the center, and all the railroad yards, literally on the corner of Michigan Avenue and the Chicago River, which is just it's unbelievable what was there. And the Illinois Central owned these yards, and of course you can see those are refrigerator cars, and they would have brought produce, meat, vegetables, potatoes, tomatoes, strawberries, or whatever, right to these downtown freight houses to go to all the restaurants and stores. That's how, things got there, particularly during the war.
Unbelievable.
This next one is, many of the buildings, again, in the background are still there, but that's the Illinois Central's Conger Street yard, which went into the South Water Street yard. And this is right near where the Art Institute is today. And but Michigan Avenue, all the buildings are on Michigan Avenue there. And much of these tracks today are covered over as part of Millennium Park and Grant Park. Delano was granted access by the federal government and the railroads to go anywhere and everywhere he wanted in his photography. So he was literally in the rail yards and had the permission of the managements. And one of my favorite photographs is one down here in the Santa Fe Corwith yard, which is on the southwest side of Chicago. It's still there, big intermodal yard today. And these are two kind of a classic pose of the engineer and the conductor on the Santa Fe, and they lived in Chillicothe, and they worked the trains east out of Chillicothe to Chicago, and then after a day, a rest period, would work the trains back. And here they are comparing their watches in the winter of 42 and 43. Because remember, we don't have radios at this time. Everything's done with the understanding of the train orders and the train schedule, coordinating so that you are working with and around the passenger trains that were running. Again, remember, this is in the war, and so there was so much traffic. The railroads moved something like 99% of all the freight and passengers in the country here.
Wow.
And the Santa Fe was one of the most important because it went directly to the West Coast, to LA. Big naval ports and so forth, and so it was a constant stream of trains, and they had to make sure that their watches were precisely accurate to avoid any collisions.
Yeah, this was a time-honored ritual of railroading. Before every run, the engineer and conductor would get out and compare their watches, and they had to have those watches inspected, I think, every 2 weeks to make sure they were keeping time accurately.
Wow.
So one of the things that Delano photographed in Union Station was the watchkeeper's store. And there was a watchkeeper store in LaSalle Street Station and Dearborn Street Station and all the major train stations where they had their watches inspected and adjusted. So it was,
And the information you're telling me reminds me the amount of research that has gone in to each one of the people in these photographs.
Marie's story presented a real challenge for how we were going to tell it in this exhibition. She didn't have any children. She did have nieces and nephews, and we were able to talk to some of them, and they didn't actually care for her very much. I think she tried to manage their lives very much in the same way that she ran the information room at Union Station, and they may not have appreciated that.
She was
very
the boss.
much. Yeah, she was the boss. But so how do we tell her story? And so we just happened to
called
find
her
from one of our members actually had bought on eBay a scrapbook, and it turned out to be a scrapbook that her employees had made for her on the occasion of her 25th anniversary, and it was
This
filled.
person you're talking about, Fred Ash, actually was doing a book on Chicago Union Station. So he saw the scrapbook that was related to Chicago Union Station where she worked, and so he bought the scrapbook to help with his research.
But Fred was not aware of our project, and we were just happened to be talking about it. When he mentioned the scrapbook, and when I figured out what it was, I said, we have to borrow that. And he generously lent it to the exhibition. But it had these beautiful poems, pen and ink drawings, watercolors, that her employees had made for her, and they clearly loved and admired
Beautiful
her.
testimonials.
So in her
Wow.
professional life, she was adored. Unfortunately, that didn't translate to her family life. But at least that scrapbook allowed us to present a more balanced picture of this incredible woman.
Unbelievable. Unbelievable.
So we have another exciting discovery that was made in this project. And this group of photographs is Daniel Sinise and his train crew that worked for the Indiana Harbor Belt Railroad on the south side of Chicago, specifically Blue Island Yard. And it's a 5-person crew. Daniel was the senior person, the conductor and foreman of the crew. And so we researched his family background. What made this particularly unusual was that the government asked Delano on rare occasions to actually go to a person's home and photograph them at home, what their normal life was with their wife and their kids and so forth. And so Mr. Sinise was recommended to him as a place for this by the local union because they held him in very high esteem. He had a perfect safety record, and his wife worked for the Red Cross, and he had a son who was a B-17 bomber in the Pacific, in the war. So he was clearly, the all-American story there in terms of all parts of the family sacrificing and giving back. And so it turns out that he had 3 boys, and they're photographed here in the exhibition. But one of the boys had a son later, Gary Sinise, who played Lieutenant Dan in Forrest Gump and
starred in CSI New York.
And was involved in many other movies and productions in the Lieutenant Dan band and so forth. And so we had no idea when we started this project that we would run into a famous actor as part of a direct descendant. And Gary himself was born in Blue Island, Illinois, because that's where his dad lived, and his dad's there. So Gary himself saw this exhibit. He was in tears. He thought he'd spend 45 minutes looking at it. He was there almost 3 hours. And many of the photographs he had never seen before. They're in the Library of Congress, so they're available to anybody. But he just didn't know that they existed. And it was so special because it was literally of his father, his uncle, his grandfather, and so forth.
Look into his father's life he'd never experienced.
And he had Daniel Sinise's railroad watch in his possession that he'd been handed down to the family, and it was one of his most prized possessions. So during the formation of this project, as we were doing the research, one of the times that he was in Chicago for another event, I went to the event and then approached him when he wasn't surrounded by all other people and started talking about it. And I didn't know him from Adam or anything, but I really, he got his attention because also when I started talking, and I brought a picture of his grandfather on a steam engine, and he'd recognized that picture, and he immediately recognized his grandfather. And so he was very supportive of this project.
And this was a family that was an actual challenge for us in the research. We're so indebted to Delano and the people at the Library of Congress for recording names, but in this case, the Sinise name hadn't been spelled correctly. And we were hitting so many dead ends trying to figure out who these people were until one of the people involved in the project, Jack Holzeder, suggested that we try alternative spellings. And when we just guessed on the right last name, we had the Sinise connection, and all of these pieces started to fall into place.
Boy, did that open up.
Yeah, no, what an incredible story, and it's just one of numerous examples of kind of the level of research involved in tracking down these people 70 years after they were
Bill and
photographed.
Scott, why don't we go look at the shop workers, and particularly the women in Clinton,
Absolutely.
and then Frank Williams,
Yeah,
Perfect.
there's a few more
so we
people
don't
to-
run out
So
of
while we're
time.
walking, tell us a little more about what Jack was doing. So we know he was photographing and we know who he was, but why was he doing this particularly?
Well, I mean, this was, the railroads were, again, just so critical to the Homefront war effort in terms of moving troops and moving supplies and moving passengers, and the railroad workers were a central part of that. Even though they weren't on the front lines fighting overseas, they were critical to the national efforts during the war. And we see a lot of the railroad workers out on the trains, the engineers, conductors that we've already seen, but behind the scenes there were people working day and night to keep the trains running, doing repair work, fixing locomotives, fixing freight cars, cleaning them. And so these are some of the people involved in that. And the ones we're looking at right now is this incredible group of women who were hired as engine wipers to clean locomotives at Clinton, Iowa, in this beautiful color photograph. Why don't you tell us a little bit more about that one, Vaughn?
Yep. So engine wipers were sort of a lowly but very physically demanding and dirty job. And you wouldn't think that a big steam engine outdoors would need to be cleaned, but it's just like any other mechanical piece of equipment. It needs to be oiled, cleaned. You know, it runs literally like a sewing machine, but you have to make sure that it doesn't get dirty and vents and other things don't get gummed up, and the ash pans are clean, and the fire burns cleanly, and so forth and so on. So a lot of maintenance for steam engines. So this group of women, it is one of my favorite photographs. This is they're taking a lunch break. But they worked all through the war in what would have been traditionally male jobs, as many of the men were off overseas. And they worked there day and night. And we found that the descendants of many of the women in this photograph talked to them, and they talked about how their mother really enjoyed working in the roundhouse. They had great camaraderie with the other women there, and there was such a bonding experience that they remained fast friends with their husbands for the rest of their lives. And this was, again, in Clinton, Iowa, just across the Mississippi from Illinois.
Okay.
And it's the first crew change point on the Chicago Northwestern west of Chicago. So it was a big railroad town because all the crews that started in Chicago went to Clinton, changed, and another set of crews would take the train further across Iowa and then to Council Bluffs and so forth and so on across the country. So they changed crews about every 120 to 150 miles. Today, that's about twice that. So
Would it have been very similar to men who worked in similar conditions? Would their families have all worked in the rail yards? Would they have come from a family of workers? Would they?
I think not necessarily. I think I don't know the exact answer to that. So this particular group of women, but I'm sure that they had, since there were a lot of other railroad workers that lived in Clinton, that they were, asked, by people who they were related to or knew well, they would take these jobs.
Unbelievable. It's a beautiful photograph.
And it was, struggling. So we have one more that we want to highlight.
Oh, this is the.
And this is a wonderful story. This is Frank Williams, who was born in the late 1893, if I remember. 1888. And he lived for more than 70 years, but he worked for 52 years on the south side of Chicago repairing freight cars for the Illinois Central. And he got into an altercation with a white man in Mississippi, where they lived in 1901, I think, when he was 13 years
That's
old.
right.
And they had to leave the area, and so he and his family, got on the Illinois Central and came up to Chicago, like many other black families, and during the Great Migration, and lived here the rest of his life. And he was married, he had many kids, and his kids had many kids, and so forth. And so we located the descendants of Frank, and who still live on the south side of Chicago, and they were incredibly enthusiastic about this project. And even at a family reunion, they made up T-shirts with this particular photo on the T-shirt, and under the caption of the T-shirt was Frank Williams,
the epitome of a hardworking black man.
And they cited Frank as inspiration for them, and many of them have become highly educated, doctors and lawyers and university professors, and but he instilled in them the importance of getting ahead in life, and that it was really just going to come from work and hard work, and there wasn't really any other way around it. And so and the descendants then all came to the original opening that we had at the Chicago History Museum and had their pictures, as many of these descendants did, pictures taken with their ancestor, and very proudly so.
so moving. And if that doesn't inspire somebody to witness the work of Jack Delano, and what every photograph does here is unveil in a cinematic way
Right.
those stories that are American stories that really created the fabric of the country we live in now. You're just not looking.
So many of these stories, or at least a small portion of these stories, are captured in the captions next to the pictures, but the catalog in the museum store has the full stories of all of these people.
Yeah, They're just
Phenomenal.
incredible stories within stories for all of these photographs. And you're right, Bill, it's just part of the American experience that is brought out in these remarkable images.
Scott Lothes, Bond French, thank you so much for making this exhibition happen, for helping us exhibit it, for pushing forward Jack Delano's work and his message really forward again. And we couldn't be happier. So with that, we conclude our tour. Now make sure you come see the exhibition in person. Again, this is Bill Conger with Peoria Riverfront Museum. Thank you.